Welcome back, everyone, to Random's Thoughts. Coming today with another Runestrike Ruminations. This time it's a preview, prelude, something like that, in that we've gotten some information about what's upcoming in the next patch, 1.0.31. I hope I got that number right. I'm like 90% sure, and I meant to double check it, but then I got excited because there's a lot of exciting things that are coming down. There's not a huge quantity of changes, but they're very impactful changes, and I want to talk about them, do the whole hot takes, and call myself out for some of my previous hot takes from a while back. Spoiler for some of the ones that are coming up that may or may not have been quite accurate. I can kind of defend them, but you'll understand as we jump into it. So, we are going to start with this one. I know that's probably formatted in an atrocious and illegible way, so you're going to get to listen to the sound of my illustrious voice for a few more, well, for a while longer, but especially for this part as I read off the comments posted in Discord from David. Excuse me. So again, this was in the feedback and suggestions channel of the official Discord. So if you're not there, definitely want to hit that up because there's a lot of news about the game that is posted there, not just in that channel, but overall in the Discord. And obviously it's the primary hub for the community, at least at this point in time. So what does this blurb say? And trust me, we'll zoom in on the details as we move forward. So it says, hi all, as Talon noted, we are making a few balance changes for the next release. These changes stem from player feedback, our metrics, and our own play. Typically, we save these for reflections, but with leaderboards imminent and the end of the year calendar squeeze already tightening, we will do some urgent ones now, more in 1.0.32, so me interjecting, patch beyond this patch, and then more with the next reflection season. So there's in that one section here where you can see there's a number of cards listed, or hopefully you can see, and we'll break those down going one by one. There's also a note in here that although Cave Raider doesn't appear on the list, Cave Raider is getting Anchor, and it summons a golden idol opposite the Cave Raider, assuming that slot is empty. Makes sense. We'll talk about that one as well. Probably start with that just to get out of the way. There's also some consideration. I have a later note to read off. I might as well throw it in now. I don't have the graphic for it, but Ogma's A3 is likely getting a change, and right now it is tentatively slated to be target minion gets +3 power and frenzy attack again for 4 blood. So we'll circle back to that one once we get through the other ones. Hopefully I don't forget since it's not actually on this list, but whatever. So as I said, there's a huge enormity very densely packed into a small number of changes. The first thing to get out of the way is that the team is deciding to make changes outside of the normal balanced schedule, and that is the reflection seasons, which I think is good. They've mentioned in the past that they're willing to make changes when things are considered egregious enough to warrant it, and that's important to know, but it's also important to have regularity. If you compare it to physical games, Magic being the obvious one, and the example I'm going to use, they do have regimented and expected banned and restricted announcements, not unlike balance change announcements such as the reflection season. And people can expect that those are coming. But if Wizards were to determine, oh, well, this card or deck or play pattern or whatever is problematic right now, they have historically, and presumably will in the future, address it as appropriate. It's good to know that the team here will also do that, so a vote of confidence for the player base as well as for the team. That phrase didn't quite work out the way I wanted, but you get what I'm saying. It boosts confidence on the player base side because we can trust the team that is constantly monitoring and not just going, oh, well, we're doing reflections next week. We should probably look at balance. No, they're constantly monitoring it and examining things. So that's good to know, which we knew from before, but it's worth reiterating. Second point, I definitely appreciate, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to the team because they are being so forthcoming with these things and especially soliciting community feedback. Now, that is potentially very dangerous, and that's something that it's been of great debate both on my streams and in other games and in other areas, forums and whatever. We all know that you can't please everybody. So if you ask, well, is this a problem? You're always going to get somebody that responds yes. Or do you say, do you like this? You're generally not going to get as much feedback on people don't open their mouth if they're happy with the scenario. They open their mouth when they're upset. So it makes it a little bit difficult, but at the same time, it does allow the team to collate information, and just the back and forth between the team and the community is important. And it's not something you see in every game. And like I said, it's both dangerous from accepting that information as well as just putting yourself out there where, like I said, people are more inclined to maybe not necessarily throw insults, but to be more negative than is necessarily appropriate. And therefore, you know, you're just taking a risk, even if it's just your personal ego doing this sort of stuff. So shout out to the team for doing this. Next point is actually about the cards. So let's jump into those. We're going to switch gears a little bit here. And I got to slide this up. So we're going to start actually with Cave Raider. So I'm going to hide this for a moment. So the Cave Raider change, as mentioned, it's going to get Anchor. It's going to summon a golden idol opposite him, assuming the opposing slot is empty. Now, I don't know that the summoning it opposing him is all that important. It's more the Anchor. Now, the combination of the two, I think, really gets at what the purpose for the card was. It's not intended to lock the opponent's board down, which is where we saw it most commonly used. And I've talked about this on stream. To bring up another Magic comparison, and for the life of me, I cannot find this article. I've seriously been looking for it for years. So if anybody watching or listening to this knows the article, hit me up with a link, because I can't find this thing. I'm pretty sure it was on the Wizards Mothership, and I could have sworn it was written by Elaine Chase, but I could be wrong. It's about the modern format, like the actual format, not like recent times. Way back when they discussed reasons for cards being banned. You'll understand why this correlates. There were some quantitative and some qualitative aspects. It was considered a turn 4 format. So if the game ends before turn 4, Wizards considered it that the game wasn't really played. Therefore, they didn't want combo decks to end the game faster than that. Now, there were caveats to that and things, but that was the general rule. If a deck or card was overrepresented, like it was 80% of every tournament, I'm making up numbers, but it was an absurd amount that it's one of those that you can quantitatively measure how much a deck or a card was taking up of the metagame share. Not necessarily that it was winning, it was just everywhere. That's a reason to nerf or ban things. And we're talking Magic, but trying to correlate it to digital card games. So if I use those interchangeably, that's why. The next one was, aside from turn 4 and how much of a metagame share, did it win too much? All right, that one's kind of obvious. If it's winning, you know, like if it's 7 out of 8 of every top 8 for however long that it existed, yeah, that's probably an issue. Now, the last one is very qualitative, and that's where you often get into a lot of discussions. And I always make an allusion to a Supreme Court case from back in the day. But if the card, deck, interaction, whatever, is considered unfun, and it's one of those that most people will recognize, most people will be able to identify, but it's very hard to put into concrete terms. In my opinion, the entire board lock deck, well, I thought it was fun to play, and I know other people thought it was fun to play. It's not exactly the most fun thing to play against for most people. Honestly, I've kind of found it interesting, but that's a digression. I can take myself out of that scenario and say, look, is the average Runestrike player really going to enjoy playing against a deck that literally prevents them from playing the game? I'm going to go out on a limb and say no. So whether this kills Cave Raider or not, like whether Cave Raider can still be used for its actual purpose or will be used for its actual purpose, I think is immaterial. And whether the Keeper deck or the Crow variation or others, because I was brainstorming a Hyperia version, for example, whether those exist or need to exist are different questions. The fact of the matter is that it probably should have been addressed, and I think it was. Now, time will tell whether it's sufficient or whether it's still going to do stuff, because there are obviously ways that you could still plop it out there and then Keeper your own Cave Raider, and then, oh, look, they punch each other forever and nothing happens. But adding the anchor prevents it from being bounced or other options happening. We'll have to wait and see, but I think it's important to address these sort of things because even if the deck did not meet the criteria, if it was everywhere or it was winning all the time or won too quickly or insert other option, I think a lot of people can take the route that, or understand the route that this was unfun, this was something that had to be addressed. So that's the Cave Raider piece. Also, I failed to mention this earlier at the top, and I really meant to, but I am live streaming this, and you can see it down there on the social stuff. It's actually down there in the corner, all the way at the bottom, the Twitch channel. So if I interject with chat's thoughts, which I'm going to do now, you'll understand why. So this might be a hot take. A lot of these balance changes seem unnecessary. I think a lot of them are appropriate, Tona. I think, and I'll explain why as we get to them. And I think it informs us on how the team wants the game to look. A lot of it can be future-proofing. The Ogma change is interesting. They basically swap 2 ability costs, which is an interesting way to balance things. Yes, I have some other thoughts from what they've mentioned before about how they plan to handle, address, utilize whatever the blood abilities. So when we get to that point, we can definitely talk about it. So the first one up is Awakened Earth. It's going to keep all of its powers, but the cost reduction is getting reduced. So it's no longer 2. Now the problem here for me is somewhat multifaceted, and you can probably hear me going through the client in the background. The big thing here, in my opinion, what I assume was targeted here, is the Laura Awakened Earth combo, where you play Awakened Earth, you have Ambush in hand, you have 5 blood, and you go, bam, tag you for 20. Presumably slightly less than 20 because you're probably running something over, but not necessarily. This now prevents you from doing that because it only reduces it by 1. Ambush is a 2-cost card, so you can't necessarily do this all in one turn. You either need multiple Awakened Earths or you need other options to help ease the burden here from a mana perspective. I think this is worthwhile, and to my earlier point, we're learning what is okay in the game, and you'll see that as we go down the list that's over there. I'm trying to point to it. As we go down the list, you're going to see more things that are end game, mid game, and early game that are going to drive where and when the devs feel the game should appropriately end. Remember, I was talking about that turn 4 rule earlier. This isn't really turn 4 rule, but there are still rough guidelines for what is fair on turn 10, what's fair on turn 9, what's fair on turn 15. Because at some point the game needs to end. But to be perfectly honest, there are times that we've all had where you sat down and be like, oh, well, that's garbage. Like that's crap that I lost in that way. And I think a lot of people felt, fairly or unfairly, that the Laura combo, we're going to refer to it as that, is in that vein. I don't know that I necessarily agree that it is, but it's a 2-card combo that does a significant chunk of damage. And I think in general, the cost reduction things, especially in this sort of game, are very dangerous. In any game with a mana system, mana ramp, mana burst, and in this case, cost reduction, all kind of go in the same bucket, even though they are uniquely different things. They function in a similar way that allow you to do things that you should not be able to do. And this has seemingly been deemed by the team as unfair. And I can get behind this one. It does give us now a benchmark to judge and justify other changes or how we're going to judge cards down the line. So, sorry, I'm checking some stuff as we're doing this. So, that's what I thought on Awakened Earth. Next up is Horus. So Horus is losing an attack going from a 4/7 to a 3/7. Somebody pointed out in Discord that now Horus will no longer kill an opposing Horus, which is interesting, but not an interaction that I personally care about. Like, yes, it matters. It matters. That's not the use case that I'm significantly worried about. It's more that it's going from 8 to 6 damage. Where that will matter, I'm not clear yet. We've been informed in the past that there is a change coming to counter at some point, so it could matter there. It's also the fact that it only has 3 attacks, so any attack reduction impacts it even more so. Like you can get it to 0 faster is the point. It also, again, informs us of what the dev team feels is appropriate for a single card to do, especially a single card combo, we'll call it. How much damage can it reasonably do? It also puts the ceiling for other things. Like, it just shaves 2 damage off. So is that a huge deal? Possibly. There will 100% be games that you would have won before that you will not win now. And I think that's fair. The interesting thing about a lot of games seem to have their big turns around 8-ish. The Horus change and Sickle Stalker change actually seems to push that back later. I think this is a slowing of the game. I think there are parts of this balance patch that definitely slow the game, and I think that's part of also why we see some of these Awakened Earth and other changes happen. Because otherwise, the Awakened Earth sort of deck, where it's, again, I'm going to say a combo, but it's not a combo deck that most people think of when you say combo deck in a card game. What most people think of is something that does an enormous wombo and kills you in one turn, excuse me. In this case, it's more, it's just a 2-card combo that does a lot of damage, but it could very likely kill you. That is now significantly easier to generate if the more early game, more aggressive things are nerfed in any sort of fashion, aka the Sickle Stalkers of the world. But I think there's a lot to talk about with Sickle Stalker for when we get there. But as far as Horus goes, I think we're covering bases there. So Iron Bull is next up, and that got a cost increase from 5 to 6. Now this is, to me, very important. Now, I have stated before, I think if any of the neutral cards, the Blitz minions we're talking about, were to be changed and we had to exempt one of them, Iron Bull for me would be the exemption. The reason being is because it's a legendary. You can only have one. Now, that being said, it's a very flimsy, very thin defense of not changing this card. Personally, I feel that, and this has been a guideline from playing many games that have this sort of deck building constraint where you are limited by, in this case, realms, but in other games it could be other things. And then you have a broad neutral faction that gives all of the others ways to plug holes in their game plans, but they're supposed to be worse. They're supposed to be worse, either in ability, in cost, because they're not as efficient, they're not as effective, whatever. Because otherwise, whatever the weaknesses are of the realms just goes away, because then they can just plug the hole with this seemingly perfect answer. Iron Bull, Sickle Stalker when we get there, Mastodon, etc. were hyper efficient, and they might still be. Iron Bull, at like 6 mana is a lot to ask for something that's probably only removing 3 drops and lower without preceding help, meaning that the opposing thing probably already attacked, probably got a turn of whatever their effect is, etc. Now, you do get a lot of value out of it. It's still going to punch the thing, punch face. It's still blitz, so it's still really strong. But I think that it's a positive change to take these neutral cards and just straight up make them worse. That seems ridiculous, or might seem ridiculous to a lot of people on the surface, but I don't see any way in which it's reasonable to have, whether it's legendary or otherwise, neutral cards that are better than the in-realm faction cards that inherently have a limitation because they can only be played in certain decks. That's basically it. So I think this makes sense. I don't think there's very many ways that they could modify the existing Iron Bull without a complete rework other than this. Nerfing the attack, I don't want to say it would make it unplayable, but it would be very difficult. Like 2 attack just doesn't kill a whole lot. Not that 3 is going to kill much more, but still. Regardless, I think that this Iron Bull change makes a lot of sense and is definitely positive, and I think there are a lot of benefits going forward. And to an earlier point, future-proofing, this allows them to have room, and I know people, it's a big meme on the internet for card games where, it's future design space, but that's a legitimate thing. Now, with Runestrike, because of the card release model, it's not as big of a deal because you're not just consuming all of the options as quickly because you need to fill out sets. Runestrike has a much shorter both time-wise and smaller release model due to the seasons. So the turnover allows them to, get small iterations out there. So I don't think that it's as much of a concern, the design space argument, but it is something to consider. So overall, like I said, I can support the Iron Bolt change. Now we're going to talk about Odin. So Odin has been the talk of the town for a while. This is an interesting one, mostly because I didn't see a problem with Odin. As mentioned earlier, the game has to end at some point, right? Now, yes, the game will end by virtue of void damage at some point. But most people are not expecting or even necessarily wanting a game to go that many turns. In fact, going to that length, whether it's mill in other games or if you play other digital card games and you end up with the equivalent of void damage, those are generally not considered enjoyable games. It's sometimes fine because, this was a great back and forth game and it went right down to the wire and, it was the last, I drew the one card out of the void or, like they dodged it or I set it up so that the void killed them because of lethal and blah, blah, blah. Generally, most people, they'll say that, but realistically, you just want to kind of play a game. And that's why games just, there has to be a point in time where the game is, okay, now everybody's swinging for the fences. And I thought Odin, honestly, the entire interaction with Odin and bouncing it a few times and making things enormous was actually a cool endgame control trick so that, your Centaurians are dropping 14 shield on you. Your Zephyr Knights are just obliterating your opponent's board and being an enormous threat. I honestly thought it was cool. A lot of people didn't like it. And I can, if you didn't like it, that's perfectly fine. I think that the bigger issue, and I mentioned this in Discord myself, is when it happened. And that goes back to my earlier point about the game needing to end. When is that appropriate? Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept whether that's turn 6 or it's turn 16. Whatever it is, the rest of the game, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be this. Maybe this is something that is informed by other decisions, but ultimately there are certain decision points, certain parts of a game that need to be pinned down, and those inform all the other decisions. If you're trying to manipulate everything simultaneously, it ends up being too difficult. And while, yes, you could end up with a good product, odds are you're just going to end up with this mishmash of, it's a smorgasbord of ideas and none of them really coherently go together, so you end up with unsatisfactory or unsatisfying games. That's why Odin, if that was, the game was going to end on 11 because you played an Odin on 10 or 12. Hey, Cargon, what's good? If you played an Odin on 10 and then the game ends on 12, okay, you have 2 turns. You have from turn 1 to turn 12 to end the game. That's your problem, opposing player. I'm the control deck. And I think that's fine. Odin just happened to be the kill condition. Now, maybe it ended the game in a frustrating way, but I'm not really sure if that's the case. But regardless, he's now going to have Anchor, and instead of doubling the stats, minions in your hand gain +3/+3. Now, for things like Zephyr Knight, that's somewhat of a buff because the Warcry is going to do more damage. It's also going to attack for more. Centaurians, it's kind of a nerf because you're not gaining as much on the back end and therefore not gaining as much shield. It's going to influence things. It's not going to allow the bouncing plays. The issue I really had, and what I mentioned earlier and then, failed to mention earlier that I posted in Discord, is that the turn it happens. My bigger concern is when Odin came down on 8 and then you were able to bounce it. Playing it on 10 and then bouncing it on 11 and then replaying it on 12 probably isn't even good. That probably lost you the game because it's just such an enormous tempo loss that it didn't matter. But doing it on 8, playing something that, like that Zephyr Knight or whatever, or Centurion gaining a bunch of health, and then possibly bouncing the Odin simultaneously and then replaying it on 10, that's where the problem comes in. So I think it's really just a matter of timing. and when things are okay to happen. It's about 2 months, Cargon. I'm looking into it too. We'll have to see how it goes. I have a lot of thoughts about that. But continuing with Odin, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know that this was really a problem. It's definitely something that, as mentioned earlier, the devs said they were listening to community feedback, right? This is clearly going to be one of those instances. Or maybe they saw a bunch of data that coincided with the anecdotes that show up in Discord. My anecdotes are, yeah, I've lost to Odins before. I've also beaten people that played 4 Odins in a game. Like, it happens. And I think the answer is just, beat them. There's a clip that I was going to pull up from day 9 from StarCraft where he used to do dailies for StarCraft 2. And one of them was somebody wrote into him and said, well, how do I beat a Protoss when they have a Templar carrier, Zealot, Archon drop army? And it's like, just go kill them. He literally says, go effing kill them. Because the answer is don't let them get there. That must have taken 1,000 years. What are you doing? And that's kind of the answer. Now, again, that ties into and supports the argument that I was making if Odin is played too early, hence the issue with Magus, the issue with potentially Sakara, just the acceleration thereof. But this does prevent it from getting nutty. We'll have to see how this one plays out. I don't think Odin was ever an issue. Have a big splashy effect like that is probably good for the job. I think that it's cool to have these big splashy effects. This might be big enough and splashy enough anyway. There were lots of ways to reanimate Odin, quite literally, whether it's Mortal Exchange or the bounces, reuse, recycle Odin. He's very green despite being Order. And that's the problem, is doing it multiple times. But again, doing it multiple times on turn 55 is virtually irrelevant. I'm sure there's a game where it matters. 90% of the time, it's not going to. The issue is when. And I think that isn't really addressed with this particular change. So yes, you will no longer have those games where, the Centurion has 35. Like, I lost to somebody who played Odin 3 times, I think, and they had a 32-32 Jupiter at one point. But I lost like 4 turns after that, and they were on the ropes the whole time. Like, the game was still afoot. And it was just by virtue of what I was playing. I forgot what it was. Could not apply enough pressure early on to push them. I don't know. I'm okay with this change. I just don't know that this is necessarily what it needs, is kind of where I'm at it. Maybe later on, Cargon. If you want to throw it in chat, that's fine. There's a couple things I'll be talking about later in the stream as well. All right, so after Odin, let's talk about Ra. So Ra also necessitates bringing up that Warcry is intended to get a change at some point in the future. It's not going to be in this patch, it's going to be later on. But Warcry is going to be when played from hand. Part of the issue is the devs do need to go back and review pretty much everything with Warcry, not pretty much everything with Warcry, to ensure that it makes sense. So for example, Phoenix's second burn is not going to work if it has to be played from hand. So that's going to have to get a rewording, as compared to if they want Ra to continue working from Dawn's 8-2, that would also need a rework. Or maybe they don't want it to, and therefore it's going to be the new Warcry. But for now, Ra is deal 8 to the enemy champion. So again, 2 less, and really probably focused on multiple activations of these things. It's fine. I know I've ended a lot of games with Ra. I've had a lot of games ended not in my favor by Ra. I think it's fine. It's, again, more informative than anything else of what is okay. What does 10 mana get you? And apparently it will get you a 5/7 body that deals 8 to the face. And I think that's acceptable. Whether it will still be playable is another story. Like, we'll have to wait and see how much this matters. Dawn will still be able to recycle it until the Warcry change goes through and we see where Ra lands. It's going to do 16 instead of 20, which is a notable difference. Initially, the 2 damage probably is like, okay, who cares? It's only 2 damage. Yes, some people survive at 2 that would have died. But when you're talking 4 damage, when you're talking 6, when you're talking 8, well, if you get to 8, you were probably dead from the amount of damage anyway. But you get the idea. I think it's fine. I think this is an acceptable change. I don't really have a problem with it. This is more in line, as we talked about with a number of the other changes so far, that a lot of this is expectation and standard setting. Like, there has to be a benchmark, and then now we know, okay, 10 mana is worth this. And how do we know? Well, the devs told us by changing those things. And now we can evaluate other stuff going forward. Now, as always, there's a specter of, well, does this prompt something else to be the new boogeyman? People love to make that argument whenever nerfs, bans, or whatever comes up. And maybe. But the problem is that we won't know for sure. Well, maybe the devs do because, they have test environments they can do this. But we won't know for sure until these changes go through. And if there's an issue now, we have to address the issue now. Like, we'll deal with those things as we go on. So next up is the other one that is probably going to be one of the more talked about changes, and that's Sickle Stalker. All of the things that I said about Iron Bull apply here as well. And the fact of the matter is that this is the change that I was actually suggesting for Sickle Stalker, to be honest. Now, there's also talk about Blitz possibly getting a rework, or conditional Blitz possibly in that rework, or this thing only gets Blitz if blah, that sort of thing. Ultimately, it circles back to what I said about Iron Bull. There's no reason that Sickle Stalker should be better than Mindless Raider. And to be honest, I still think it's better than Mindless Raider. I actually saw a comment in Discord that somebody said, well, this is terrible now. Why would you ever play it? Well, first of all, you're going to play both. I don't think there was any deck that had access to Mindless Raider that was not including 2 Sickle Stalkers first. And I still think that that's going to be true because it's cheaper. That's the bottom line. Virtually everything that you truly care about that can kill Sickle Stalker is probably going to kill Mindless Raider as well. Yes, you have targeted removal that Combust hits one, Annihilate hits the other. Okay, I get that. But your Meteor Storms, that sort of thing, are still going to deal with both. Now, Twister, nothing really changes. Now, the issue here, and to chat's earlier point about slowing the game down, I think this does slow the game down. I think that it is going to hurt aggro more than it's going to hurt control. I think you can still end up... You could still end up in a position where you're going to want Sickle Stalker as the control deck because it serves multiple purposes, but this may screw up the curve with aggro decks. I'm going to have to see. I have a hard time believing that I'm going to cut these regardless. It's just going to make some of the hands less explosive, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's perfectly acceptable. Blitz is still powerful enough that as of right now, I plan on running it. We'll have to see how it plays out. But I just don't see a reason to cut these things from basically any list at this point. It's just going to make turns slightly less powerful. So aside from Sickle Stalker, we now are moving into a bunch of champion changes. And we do have the Ogma A3 one, which is not listed here, that I'll have to read off again. So Dawn's Eclipse, her A3. Choose Solar or Lunar Eclipse. Well, what are those? The Solar Eclipse is your minions gain +2/+2. Lunar Eclipse is minions your opponent's controls lose -2/-2, as compared to today, where you get a combination of both. It's +2/+1 on your side and -1/-2 on their side. Stalker now dodges both Combust and Annihilate. It's not a straight... You're correct. You're correct. My example was not accurate. Going back to Sickle Stalker briefly, yeah. Now that it's at 5, it actually dodges Combust. You are correct. It's not a strict nerf. But I think for most use cases, it will end up being that way. However, like I said, I think the rest of what I was saying stands, that I'm still running it. But for Dawn, I mentioned a while back, I felt Dawn's A3 was problematic. I know there was somebody in chat not long after the champion rebalance went live a while back that jumped in, and we played some games, and then I ran into other people on ladder, and I did the Dawn video where just the A3 focus deck, where it doesn't matter if this minion generates blood, play it, and then buff your team to an enormous level and just run your opponent over, was a thing. Is a thing. Is the deck unbeatable? No. It is a very frustrating play pattern, and it kind of pushes things to, you have to have blitz, or you have to have targeted removal, which you can make that argument about a lot of things. So that isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. But I felt that, personally, that the deck stymied too many things, suffocated too many things, stifled too many things, whichever way you want to put it. I think this makes sense. I disagree with with Discord, as per usual. I think this is more thematic. I think it makes more sense this way. Whether it is good enough, or Dawn is going to have to shift back to being an A2 focus deck, is another story. I think generating a bunch of blood and then making a ton of 3/5s is not spectacular. Well, there'll be 3/6s in this case, because you had a 1/4, you get +2/+2. The key component previously was could be removal, could still be. It could be a board buff, it still could be, but in a lot of scenarios, it was both. And the swing of +4 either way, or +4, -4, whatever, a 4-point swing was enormous. It was just absolutely enormous, and basically guaranteed that you're wiping your opponent's board, you're leaving a sturdy board, and they essentially can't play anything into it that isn't just absolutely outclassing you or straight up removing something. Because then you're going to run it over, you're going to get to play more stuff, and then by the time your opponent can, if they're just waiting, by the time they can build up a board or enough cards to do something again, you probably have enough blood to just do it all over again and annihilate them. That's the play pattern that, not unlike the Keeper Cave Raider build, effectively locked people out of the deck when they were playing a fair game plan. If you're playing the way that I think Runestrike is intended to be played, where you're battling for board position, you're both playing minions as opposed to doing some wacky combo or just stalling to the end of the game and then doing a wombo to take your opponent out or whatever, even though a lot of digital card games do devolve to that. If you're playing the way the game is quote-unquote intended to be played, and again, I'm inferring that, not something the devs have said, Dawn really punished you for that. And these board-wide effects, whether we see them on individual cards or blood abilities, are incredibly powerful. But on blood abilities, it's exponentially more so, because you will always be able to use these. It is exceptionally unlikely that the game ends before turn 5. Like, if it's not a disconnect, or your opponent sees your name and then just concedes, you're probably not ending the game before turn 5. And odds are you're not ending the game before turn 10 either. So, minimum 2 of these. And that assumes that the Dawn player doesn't do anything else to influence their blood count or whatever. Especially in realms that have innate blood generation because it's light, shadow, this is potentially very dangerous. To be fair, a winning strategy in most CCGs is to play the game the least intended way possible. Absolutely true, Atona. The most effective way to play card games, and this is not just a Runestrike thing, here's your old man wisdom moment. Don't interact with your opponent. The best decks are the least interactive decks. And it is a constant battle between developers, designers, and players to ensure that the devs are setting up the sandbox in such a way that the players can't just circumvent everything and flip the sandbox on their opponent. We're saying sandbox instead of table because that meme is kind of that horse has been beaten enough. But anyway, I think this change has its heart in the right place. I'm honestly unclear as to whether this is appropriate. Like, does it actually cripple Dawn? Because I thought the strategy was cool. I don't think a numbers shift, because it's just always going to be, okay, well, is this good enough? If the numbers are good enough, the Dawn A3 build would be oppressive in the previous iteration. If the numbers aren't good enough, you just can't play it because it's irrelevant. And I think that was always going to be a battle. Yeah, it might just be on the fringe tier 2 or something like that. But I think that it creates a very frustrating board state on the other side. And it prevents you from doing a lot of things. This now allows you to, because of the modality, the modal nature of it, you still can do either one, but you need to decide. Now, I think personally that this will cause Dawn to shift back into A2 focus builds and then rely on maybe doing one of these, like, okay, well, I have a -2/-2 that I'm going to clear the board with at some point, or the game's close to ending, I can buff my whole team and push the game out, as opposed to spamming one end or the other. Even with the previous A3 focus build, it felt difficult to generate enough blood in order to do it enough with both effects unified. Now that they're split, you're going from, like, let's say it was 20 blood a game in order to be able to do it, quote unquote, enough to ensure victory. Now you're looking at 40. That's a lot. The definition of meta is basically the most oppressive build possible. So yeah, if it's no longer oppressive, the power gamers will switch to something else that is. Yes. And that's where the struggle between, and it makes it sound more adversarial than I intend, but you're absolutely right, Entropy, and Atona also, that it's the struggle between the developers and the devs who they're trying to please multiple segments of the player base. The people who want to play powerful cards and want to win. The people who just want to do wacky stuff. Or the people who just have their favorite pet cards and they want to play them. Or insert other psychographic profile besides Spike, Johnny, and Timmy. And then the player base who's, of course, trying to utilize all those things to their fullest. And neither is wrong. Like, it's perfectly fine to want to win. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm biased because that's the way I play a lot of games. But I also play a lot of stuff from the Timmy perspective. Rarely from Johnny, but, sometimes that happens. Nobody, well, maybe not nobody, but rarely are people always one thing, like 100% of the time. So, the point is that there are certain abilities that can be scaled where it's like, okay, now this thing is fair. I think Dawn's, because of the high investment, necessitates that it has to be certain things. And plus, the numbers are just going to dictate, based on what else is in the meta, that this is either effective or not. That's a good question, Atona. I have no idea what profile that is. But honestly, I think this causes Dawn to shift to a new build. I'm not opposed to that. It was fun while it lasted. So, now we're on to the next. And that is Ogma. So Ogma has a litany of changes. Basically, the whole kit is changing. So I'm going to read the two, and then I'll read off the third, which is not pictured here. The first change is A1. Is now going to be 2 blood instead of 3. Target minion gains +1/+1 and trample. Not really a huge departure, but as mentioned previously by the devs, they don't really want, and they've actively avoided, blood abilities on the same champion costing the same amount. So you're not going to see a champion with blood abilities 2/2/2 or 3/3/3 or even 3/3/2. The idea is to diversify them. Now, personally, I don't care. They could all be 1, they could all be 10, they could all be 5. I think it would actually be interesting if they had a champion or champions that were in that way to break the conformity of the existing configuration. But that's another in-depth discussion that we can get into another time. We'll get through the changes, and then I'm going to circle back to the whole kit. So Savage Shout is getting another change, and here's where I have to call myself out, but again, I'll wait until after we get through it. Change from 2 blood to 3 blood. So it's still going to deal 2 to a minion and then 2 to the face, but it's going to cost 3 instead of only 2. Notable change. Now, the third change, which is not listed here and was only mentioned after this was posted, there were a number of options that were presented for changing Ogma's A3. And allegedly, I may have contributed to Ogma's A3 getting changed. So shout out to me. But what was elected or what is getting moved forward right now, and of course, I should have said this at the beginning, but obviously all of this is presumably subject to change. We don't know if all of this is set in stone. We'll find out when the patch actually hits. But, I mean, a lot of this makes sense and is consistent in a number of ways, both what they've done in the past and what we're hearing and seeing from them. So I don't see things changing like an enormous amount. But anyway, the new Ogma A3 is target friendly minion gets +3 power and frenzy attack again for 4 blood. As compared to the current power, where it's 5, your whole board gets some attack, like +1/+1 or +1/+0, and frenzy attack again. So I'm going to start with calling myself out because way back, and I think this is important to recognize when you either make mistakes or, and I'll explain why it may not quite be a mistake, but, maybe an error in judgment, whatever. When the last, like the big champion rework happened, I was concerned about Ogma possibly falling off the face of the earth because of the previous change to A2, where it used to buff the attack by Ogma's attack of a minion to this. And I felt that it would be difficult to push through blockers, through other cards that would end up stymieing the advancement of the Ogma player. That obviously wasn't the case. Ogma's been fine. Now, I was coming at that from the perspective of a quote-unquote fair Ogma build, where I was not building into A3. I just didn't have it at the time, literally could not use it. Since then, we've had the champion leveling rework, and I've had more experience with it, and played against other people with Ogma. And Ogma's A3, I mean, I don't think I ever thought it was bad, but it's pretty damn good. So we're going to work our way back up. The Ogma A3 change, I think, is relevant, and this is where I possibly influence things, because the devs indicated that they either saw one of my streams or something, although they could have easily seen any tons of Ogma players that are out there, so this isn't unique to me, where it's play Mastodon Herd, A3, clobber your opponent, just absolutely pulverize them. I think that it makes sense in line, especially with the other changes that we saw up at the top of the list, where, okay, the end game stuff, there's a limit to what you can do in the end game and what's considered fair, what's considered unfair. I think that there's a greater issue, and we maybe do this after talking about the patch, but I think there's a greater issue with a lot of the recovery cards and the board fill cards. But that is directly tied to and correlated with the board sweepers. There's a lot of ebb and flow, a lot of give and take, wax and wane, whatever, about, well, this effect exists, so we need this to give people a reasonable chance to combat it. And until some of those pillars that we were talking about earlier of, look, we got to pin something down. We're either accepting that every faction has a board clear and this is how they work, and therefore all these other things are going to change, and then we get these board fillers like Mastodon Herd, Longship Raid, etc., and then we need to worry about Ogma A3, or we change one of those variables and then the other ones can be modified afterwards. In this particular case, the devs have elected to go with changing Ogma's A3, focusing where Hyperia is now going to be the wide aggro deck, or just wide build, as you can tell from Matriarch Sentinels and a number of other effects, whereas Ogma is going to be the tall or vertical build, where it's, I'm all in on this one thing and I'm just going to crush you with this one dude. It seems reasonable to I was going to say pigeonhole, but apply a theme to each of these. I kind of liked Ogma's A3. It made his kit feel like a fully rounded aggro build. However, it does make sense with slowing the game down from turn 8. Yes, I did like the well-rounded nature where it's, and this is my own opinion about how the champion should work, and that does not seem to be something that is shared by the dev team, which is perfectly fine. And I think, I know I'm adding a lot of caveats to everything, but look, if you disagree with the dev team, if you disagree with any dev team, it's okay. It's allowed. I don't know where you, dear listener or viewer, are from. I live in America. It's a free country. You're allowed to have your differing opinion. You're even allowed to have a wrong opinion, apparently. And yes, opinions can be wrong. Discussion for another day. But point is, I can have my own opinion about what I'd like to see the champions to have. The devs are designing their game. So that's a me problem, not a them problem. To an extent. Obviously, there's a give and take there as well. But point is that I would prefer to see more narrow blood abilities that say, okay, well, in this scenario, in this matchup, I actually want to go for this blood ability more often than my typical game plan that I do against everything else. Hence why I liked the idea of Ogma having the, two vertical focused, we'll say, blood abilities, really one, but you can kind of count a two, and then a third wide or horizontal focused blood ability. But I can certainly understand why they, if they disagree with the devs that breaking into your phones and whisking you away to cells, don't listen to Rando. Yep, that's absolutely what happens. No, it doesn't happen. Don't anybody believe that. So on the other hand, I really do love the theme of Hyperia. Okay, I'm going to build an army. Whereas Ogma is, no, I'm going to build a demigod and I'm going to stomp all over you by powering this one thing up. And I think both of them are cool. It's thematic, and that really speaks to me. I think that's fine. At the 10,000 foot view, makes sense. Now, how does this actually impact Ogma? And am I going to eat my words again about, is this going to be a problem? I don't know that this is going to be a problem. It's certainly going to hurt Ogma. It's hard to see this as anything but a nerf. Spamming A2 adds up. It's removal. It pushes damage. It may not be direct removal. Maybe you have to combine it with the minion that's running into their blocker, but you're still eliminating cards and leaving a threat on the board. The fact that A1 is more spammable is definitely relevant because trample is a very relevant keyword. And here's where things start to get weird. While this does, in conjunction with the A3 change that again is not on screen, it does eliminate the Mastodon stuff. Yeah, you're ahead of me, Atona. That's exactly where I'm going. For anybody that's curious, it makes random blitz minions more threatening. Getting dunked for 7 instead of 5 is a thing. And that's exactly it. A lot of the complaints that I've seen, and I can understand, I don't necessarily always agree with, depending on the scenarios, but a lot of the complaints that I've seen have been surrounding Ogma primarily, and it even goes outside of Ogma, just blitz minions. So now those blitz minions don't even have to go in an empty lane. It's significantly easier, even though it's only 1 blood, to spam a 2 blood ability than a 3 blood ability. So now every blitz minion is +1/+1 and smashing. They're not smashing quite as hard because instead of +2/+2, you only have +1/+1, but it is going to be relevant. And again, trample is a very relevant ability, especially in aggressive decks because the chip damage adds up on top of your champion punches. There are plenty of games where everybody's played on one side or the other where it's, I just need to eke out 6, 7, 8 more damage. Well, guess what? If that thing had trample, or 2 or 3 things over the course of the game had trample, you probably hit that damage several turns ago, and now the game just ends. Or you just play an enormous minion and go, all right, it has trample, get in there, that sort of thing. It clearly limits the options for your opponent's blockers as well, because even if you play in an open lane and I'm just buffing it for the attack, all right, you want to block? Great, that thing better have a huge butt because the excess damage is going to your face. So, how will this do overall? I have a hard time believing that Ogma is going to fall off the face of the earth because I played and still continue to play an enormous amount of games where they are decided by the runes themselves, almost contrary to what I've said before about blood abilities being the most important thing in the game, and they are. Ogma's the exception that proves the rule. I hate that saying, but I think everybody knows what I'm getting at there. That he's able to force a lot of things just by virtue of the cards that he has access to in nature and chaos, on top of the neutral blitz minions. You can apply a ton of pressure. You have aggressively minded blood abilities. You can just go for the throat. If your opponent clears the board, you have Viking Longship Raid and Mastodon Herd on top of the Blitz minions to recover in a fantastic way. A lot of those options are still there. Yes, Iron Bowl is worse. Yes, Sickle Stalker is worse. Yes, his blood abilities are worse. But I don't know that they're significantly so that it's going to be an enormous problem. I think Ogma's still going to be fine. He's probably still going to be the premier aggro deck. For example, I don't think Magus Soldiers suddenly pushes him out. It's going to be closer, obviously, but I don't think Magus Soldiers suddenly beats Ogma as the top. I'm not talking head to head. I'm talking in tier structuring. I don't know how much this is going to impact, say, the Morlich matchup, which I always felt was difficult, but winnable. There are a number of matchups along those lines, such as Morlich, that I'd be curious how this makes out and how things shape up. But overall, I agree with the comments the chat made that this feels like it slows down a lot of things. This patch, I mean. It eliminates a problematic archetype or at least tries to address, we'll see if it completely eliminates it, in the Keeper Lock build. It addresses some other blood abilities that I think were out of line in Dawn. Now, we'll have to see how this actually plays out. We'll have to see how this actually plays out. I'm trying to collate my overall thoughts on it. I do like this patch, but I mentioned this offline. I think there's still a lot of changes that appear to be in flux, and until we get that Warcry change and see which ones actually end up on which side of Warcry, we're obviously constantly looking ahead to the next season. There's a number of things that are coming down the pipe that make it difficult to assess what is this environment going to look like even a month from now, given these changes. Now, the other piece that I will throw out here is that it's very difficult to determine. I was trying to think of a better way to put this, but to be perfectly honest, it's difficult to judge strictly from the ladder because a lot of people are playing either suboptimal builds or playing suboptimal builds suboptimally. And that's not necessarily because they're bad or they're bad at deck building or anything like that, because that's not implied. The idea is just that we don't have the ladder system in play, the leaderboards, which is coming and is apparently intended to come pretty soon. But since it's not here and there isn't really an incentive other than pride to play for a specific thing, a lot of people are doing kind of like what I've been doing. I've been playing literally a rogue build, not rogue as in like, oh, well, it's a fringe archetype. It's rogue as in it's built around the tribe rogues. I've been playing a fuse build, like things that are not really, no one's going to say they're tier 1. No one's going to be all excited about, I'm going to take down the world championship with this. Not there is one at the moment, but these builds are things that you'll encounter on ladder and it just kind of happens. So, and on top of that, people just may not have a full collection. So they may not straight up not have access to these things, or they just unlock the champion. And while they have the cards, they don't have the experience. There's a lot of factors that go into it that could be influencing how or why people are doing certain things. So it's difficult, even under the best circumstances in Runestrike, to get quality information for this sort of assessment. So a lot of this is just kind of best guess. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt until we can actually play with it, until we can actually try it, and you can draw your own conclusions. And even then, because of all those factors and others, it's going to be difficult to determine where things ultimately lie. When there's things on the line, whether that's through tournaments, it's through ladder, it's whatever, that's when people are actually going to truly put in the effort, and we'll see how broken things can possibly be. But overall, like I said, I think that I really do like this patch. I think it addresses things, even if I'd like to see, because there are other cards that I think need to be looked at the very least. Like I could create a watch list, and maybe we'll do that after I close up this video. But I think that'll do it for the patch discussion this time. We'll see if everything stays exactly as it's over there and the notes that I read off. But I'm looking forward to 1.31 or 0.31, and we'll see what else it brings. But that'll do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And Black Lives Matter.